welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 60, and this is a series of short stories from my 28-year career in the UK police force. Hopefully you found it interesting so far. Thanks very much for coming back if you are, and if not, welcome. Really good downloads this week, thank you again. We've gone over the 13,000 mark now for total downloads, so that's amazing, thank you. Continuing to enjoy it, still got a few more to go yet, I'm not quite sure how many. Apologise if the sound's not great today. It's very, very stormy where I am, and I've been trying to find somewhere that's not kind of rainy and windy, so hopefully you won't get too much of that in the background, but as a result I think it's going to be a little bit echoey again, so just bear with it please if you will. So today we're going to talk about some more diving, but specifically an actual individual case again. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. It's quite a well publicised one, this, so certainly you can have a look online at any other details. I hadn't been on the dive team that long when this job happened, probably a year or so, something like that. And I don't think at this point I'd been involved in a sort of particularly high profile case. Been busy doing lots of work, but nothing that would necessarily come to the public's attention. Well, this was about to change with this job for sure. So we're going to talk today about Gemma McCluskie. She was a 29-year-old woman from sort of northeast London, the Hackney area of London, and she was an actress. Particularly well known in the UK at the time because she'd starred in EastEnders, which was a soap opera, or is a soap opera that runs in the UK, very, very popular, been running almost 40 years now, I think, and sort of watched by millions weekly, so lots of people get to know the characters and get sort of caught up in the characters. So Gemma had played a role, a part in EastEnders for some time, so she was quite well known. And on the 1st of March 2012, she was at home with her brother, Tony McCluskie. We know that she was at home on that day, and we also know that she'd argued with her brother that day. She was seen later in the evening, about 8 p.m. in the evening, in a local sort of kebab shop getting some food at takeaway, but not seen again, and subsequently reported missing by her brother. So the first I came to know about this one, although that stuff had happened, it was some 5 or 6 days later. I'd started to see some stuff in the local press, because what happened is, as a result of her being reported missing, certainly friends of hers had been around the local area and had, put up posters and had been asking around. But certainly on the 5th of March of that year, 2012, 100 of her friends got together and had a very public sort of demonstration of their concern for the fact that Gemma was missing, and they sort of flooded the local area with people and posters and were asking questions, I guess similar to how police would for a house-to-house inquiries, but on a much larger scale. And they turned out, a lot of people very quickly, they made sure the local press were involved, and certainly I'd seen it on the news. But didn't realise at that point that this was ever going to sort of involve me with anything. Of course, with missing people, particularly in London, I'm sure anywhere in the world, but particularly the capitals around the world, there is hundreds, if not thousands, in fact definitely thousands of missing people reported daily, and of course for all sorts of reasons, and 90% of them go missing of their own choice. They've had a relationship breakdown, or they've lost their job, or there's any number of reasons, and invariably they're found safe and well, but lots get reported. And of course, to the people that are reporting them missing, it's the most important thing in the world. I think sometimes as police it can be easy to become a little bit complacent about these things, but then in fairness, if you've had your 6th missing person report of that day, it's perhaps easy to think this is another one that's just, run off with the neighbour, or, owes a lot of money and has decided to start a new life somewhere else, or whatever, because that is quite common. But certainly, yeah, so family and friends were making a big effort to try and find her. Now, she lived nearby the Regent's Canal, which is a canal that runs through London, very, very busy canal. Lots of canal boats up and down all the time, and you'd be surprised how busy these waterways are. Lots of people live on them permanently and travel back and forward through the locks, and we're going to talk about those particularly. But the job first came to our notice on the 6th of March, because one of these canal barges that people live on that was chugging down the river, you know, they're very slow, sort of 2 or 3 mile an hour, hit something quite large in the canal. And it turned out to be a suitcase that had sort of floated up to the surface, and they'd hit, and I think they'd grabbed hold of the suitcase and sort of moved it to one side. You know, a lot of these people are quite good in that if they've hit something, they'll explore it and move it to the, you know, one side of the canal. They don't want other boats to keep hitting it. So I think the people on that barge had moved the suitcase to one side, and one of them opened it and got a bit of a shock, because inside that suitcase was a torso of a female, no limbs, no head, just a torso. So you can imagine he got a pretty nasty shock, I suspect, when he opened that suitcase. So of course the job then came to the notice of the police and ultimately us on the dive team. So we were tasked to go along. Now, several issues came up. The first one being that fairly quickly they realised or believed it could have been Gemma McCluskie, as she'd been reported missing in the area, and they hadn't managed to formally identify the torso yet. They knew that the brother had reported her missing. Obviously we'd seen the press stuff of all the family, you know, back and forward, and friends trying to locate her. Certainly everything pointed to the fact that it was her, but that wasn't confirmed at that point. It takes a while for those things to happen, you know, this confirmation. But so we started to carry out a search in the area. Now the big problem was that she went missing around about the 1st of March, and this torso wasn't found to the 6th. So you had 5 or 6 days of an open canal. We immediately shut the canal to all boat traffic. But of course, unfortunately, you'd already had 5 days of boat traffic going back and forward through this canal. Like I say, a very busy canal. And then, you know, every mile or two, or, you know, or whatever, there would be a lock, you know, that the boats travel through. And what happens when, so a boat enters a lock and then it closes the gate. These locks are quite big, you know, sort of oblong in shape, maybe 50 metres long, something like that. So you can get 2 or 3 canal boats in at a time. You drive into the canal, into the lock rather. The lock closes behind you, the gates close behind you. And then you open a chamber, and in fact a sort of small door the other end with a winch cable. And what happens is the water either then flows in or flows out, depending on whether that lock you're in is going to go up and increase the height of the water, or you're actually working your way down, and therefore it's a sort of stepped way of either increasing or lowering the height of the water as you travel through the canal system. But what that does do is introduce an incredible flow of water either in or out of the lock, and of course that comes from the main body of the canal. So close to these locks, you have a, you know, real heavy flow of water, which can obviously disturb and move, particularly in our case, move things. Now we had no way of knowing. It appeared, you know, that this body had been dismembered, but you know, into how many pieces. And I know it sounds gruesome, but the reality is that's the sort of thing we have to think about, because if, like last week, you're talking about potentially an entire leg, you know, that's quite a big item and relatively easy to find. But for all we know, you know, it's been chopped into much smaller parts, which makes it even harder. They suspected the brother, Tony McCluskie, straight away, and the detectives started looking at his movements and gathering the CCTV. And in fact, around about the same time that they confirmed that this was her body, they had CCTV of the brother taking a large suitcase with wheels on it, you know, a wheelie suitcase, into a local taxi office and asking to be taken to the Regent's Canal. And when they then went and spoke to that driver, he said that the suitcase was particularly big and heavy, and that Tony had asked for help, you know, putting that suitcase into the back of the taxi. And so the taxi driver and him lifted this very heavy suitcase into the back of the taxi. And in fact, the driver even remarked that he jokingly said to Tony, "What have you got in here, mate? A body, you know?" And he just kind of, you know, laughed it off. Took him down to the canal. They then had CCTV of the brother walking down onto the towpath beside the canal. And then some hour or two later, I believe it was, certainly a period of time later, they had CCTV of him leaving the canal by a different towpath, but some distance away from where he'd gone on. So from a searching point of view, you had a start and a finish point, but we had no idea of what had happened, in between. And unfortunately, the piece of canal that he had actually sort of entered on and left on, it stretched over a very big distance. I think it was something like 2 miles. Within that area was a number of locks. I think it was something like a dozen locks. And I've already described, this flow of water. So remember, we've now had 5 days of the locks being opened and closed, sometimes up to 10 times a day, to let boats through, and multiple boats, probably in the region of, 50 boats at least, back and forward, the locks open and closing, huge flow of water. So from a searching point of view, we knew that this was going to be very difficult. And in fact, this was the longest dive job that I was ever consistently on the same job. It took some 6 months in the end. So we started our search, and as we talked about last week, we know that we've got our 2 main types of search, our arc search and also our jackstay search, and again, if you listen back to the last couple of episodes, I explain those in great detail, what all they consist of. But arc searching, which is generally used for a body, was decided wasn't suitable because we didn't know what sort of size the body parts had been cut into, and there was concern that that we could miss parts if we arc searched, because if they were very small parts, for example, a foot by itself, that's a very small target, and you might think, oh, that'd be easy. Well, it would be if you were swimming along on the bottom of a swimming pool with absolutely nothing else on there. But the canals in London, and particularly the Regent's Canal, are full of every piece of rubbish you can imagine. Builders' rubbish in bags and scaffolding pipes, mopeds, it can be 3 or 4 feet deep of old beer cans. Literally, if you can think it, it's in there. We found pretty much everything from the weird, to the common, full of bottles, full of bin bags, full of builders' rubbish, moped shopping trolleys, etc. It just goes on. And if you can imagine a relatively small item tucked away within that sort of area, very, very difficult to find this stuff, particularly if you're doing this arc search, which is quite quick because it's for bigger items. So we decided we'd have to do a jackstay search. Now the problem is, again, as we discussed with that, it's very, very slow. In a standard canal that might be 15 meters wide, we would actually only expect to do 10 meters a day of width of canal, by putting 5 or 6 divers in, because that's how slow it is. It's fingertip searching, really, and it pretty much had to be for this, because of course they also didn't know how she'd been killed. Was there a weapon involved? And that again is obviously quite a small item, or it could be depending on what it was. So yeah, it brought up a number of challenges, and all we had as a starting point is obviously where the suitcase with her torso was in originally. So that was our start point, and we had to go, don't forget, we have to put an overlap in. You can't start where it is, because initially that suitcase could have travelled 30 metres on the surface or on the bottom, dragged along by that canal. If that canal boat had snagged it on the bottom, it could have dragged it for 30 metres before it came to the surface. So we had to put in a big overlap, which put us back even further. And of course, detectives were very, very keen for us to crack on and complete the search. They wanted to find all the other bits if she was in there, and also sort of be able to wrap up their case, as it were. So we had several frustrated detectives down, sort of repeatedly asking us, how long is this going to take? And they were confidently coming down and saying, well, we know that he went on here, and we know that he left there, so assuming she's the bits of her are between this area, how long is this going to take? And you're saying 2, maybe 3 years. They have no clue just how slow it is. But the problem is, you can't speed this process up. You can't skim across it, because if you do and miss it, you might as well not bothered in the first place. So it was just going to be a really slow process. But we did tell them that what was likely to happen, that even when individual parts are bagged up, if that's what had happened, there's a high likelihood that those individual parts would float to the surface. So not only did we have us out the divers, but we also had our, the normal marine unit in their boats doing surface searches, because we realised that certainly within a week or 2, it was very likely that the parts were going to start to float to the surface. And of course, all during this time we had the canal shut off initially, but it's a very busy waterway, and you couldn't do that long term. I think we maybe had it shut off for a couple of weeks, but you couldn't long term shut that canal off. It was a real pinch point for boats. And of course, unfortunately, on top of that, you also had all the family and friends coming down repeatedly, sort of still carrying out their own searches and very interested in what we were doing and how we went about it. And then you also had the press as well, so lots of press on bridges, getting their shot for the evening news or the weekly news of the divers. It always makes for good papers selling, I guess. To us it was every day, but to everyone else, it's something a little bit out of the norm. So we had to be very careful and watch our P's and Q's in terms of what we were saying and how much we were telling people, and also being professional. You can't afford to be caught out saying something, by a wayward microphone that would sort of put us in a bad light. But very difficult search, and we started off and continued on with that search. And then after over a period of weeks and months, in fact, now we weren't exclusively on this job. I think, as I've explained before, we had a series of, we would try and work several jobs at once. So after a while, after several weeks or maybe a month on this job, it was perhaps scaled back in that we would then be doing a day or two of other jobs and coming back to this. So we would always come back, and there'd be maybe a day or two a week on this job where we'd continue on. Because there was a lot of pressure on us, from other murders that were happening within London that were equally important, to keep searching on. So we carried on, and over the next weeks and months, various parts of poor Gemma were found, exactly as we imagined, sort of bagged up. So various limbs came out, and we obviously had to search the locks themselves, as we'd already talked about. Now, locks are very difficult to search. Well, they are in some respects. They're easy in that they're nice set environments. They're, as I said, they're maybe 50 metres long, 10, 15 metres wide, and they're an oblong shape. So you have a sort of set pattern to work to, which is nice, because on a riverbank that kind of goes in and out, that's a lot harder perhaps to search consistently. But the big issues, they create all sorts of dangers. You have to be very careful around. So at the bottom of each lock gate is some smaller gates that are actually opened by the person on the surface who puts in their big sort of windy handle and winds the mechanism. They slowly open or close those gates, and that then allows the water to come in or go out at a relatively controlled rate. Still a huge flow of water that creates massive whirlpools on the surface. But from a diver's point of view, you have to be very, very careful that they're closed before you start working, and that they don't get opened during your work process. And then you have to be also very careful depending on which side you are, because if the lock is currently empty, say, let's say it only has, they're never empty, but the lowest they get is they might be a metre deep, say, for example, when they're at their lowest. If you were working in that lock and it was a metre deep, that's fine if you're inside it, there's no pressure issues. But if you were searching on the outside of that lock gate, and that might be, say, 3 metres deep on the outside of that lock gate, but on the inside it's only a metre deep, so there's a huge body of water wanting to get in that lock. Now, as a diver, you have to be incredibly careful around those gates, because if there was any gap at all in the gates or the individual lock, those hatches I've described that are set down into the lock gates themselves, that entire body of water of the canal behind you is trying to get into that lock. Now, as a diver, if you get too close to a gap in that where there is a bit of a flow, you will effectively get pinned to that gate. It's all about the high pressure one side and the low pressure the other side. And if that happened, worst case scenario, you're never getting off there. The only way you could possibly release that pressure is to then equalise and fill the lock from within, which would be very difficult. So It was always a little bit nerve-wracking working around those gates. You say you had to be really sort of wits about you, and certainly for the people on the surface had to be your attendant, and particularly the dive supervisor had to be very switched on as to if there were potential gaps or leaks in those gates, and also members of the public coming along and opening them by mistake, not realising, which we had on a couple of occasions. So yeah, they were quite difficult or dangerous. They could be dangerous to search for sure. You really needed to sort of know what you were doing. So as time went on, the detectives became sort of increasingly frustrated and wanted their search carried out quicker. So one of the senior detectives had been speaking to a private company, a civilian company that worked with ROVs, remotely operated vehicles that you see, effectively underwater drones, is probably the best way of describing them, with cameras and the sonar and what have you. And I suspect that he was searching for a way of, speeding up the process, and he'd been in contact with this civilian company and was telling them, I assume, about, the issues we were having searching and how slow it was, etc. So anyway, he turned up one day and said to us, I've got this company that reckon that they can cover, this half a mile of canal that was going to take us weeks and months to search. He said he can cover it in a day with his machine. He's got state-of-the-art equipment, and he's got this Gucci sonar on it, and it's going to be able to do all this stuff that will make your job so much easier, and we kind of looked at each other and rolled our eyes and were like, we knew that this wouldn't work. But this was a senior officer who was absolutely insistent that we work with these guys for a day to see how we got on. So we said, yeah, sure. So the plan was that the ROV started, and it would sweep along the bottom in a sort of systematic pattern, as we would. And then any anomalies they found either on the camera, which was unlikely because the visibility wasn't great, but more likely that they'll turn up, something on their sonar that they believe could be something that needed to be checked. Excuse me. They would then ask for a diver to be put in to go and identify that target to see whether it was, what we were looking for. But we did explain to them, there is so much rubbish in here that just isn't going to work. This isn't a nice flat pond with a gravelly bottom, nothing else on it. It may work for that scenario, but certainly not for what we were going to do. But, whether the financial side of it came into it or, pride, I don't know. They were insistent, they could do this, and our bosses told us, well, work with them for a day and see how it goes. So that's exactly what we did, and to be honest with you, it was a complete farce, as we expected it would be. So the ROV went in, he started his systematic search, although when we were quizzing the people that were using the ROV about how do you know where you've searched, because we need to be able to say that this area is completely searched. And he was, again, we were told, state-of-the-art GPS tracking, it tells us, where we've been and where we're going, and plans out a route and all this. And okay, right, fine. The problem was the GPS didn't work particularly well, and we were watching this drone. It wasn't going in a nice sort of search pattern. It was flitting about from one thing to another. And what was happening was they were seeing targets on their sonar and then deciding that, that was something worth looking at. So they asked for a diver to go in, the diver would go down and check, and you come back and go, yeah, it's a tyre, So then you come back to the side, and then they go in again, and 15, 20 minutes later, they say, oh, we've got another target here, we'd like you to look at it. And you go down, put the diver in, come back, yeah, it's a moped. Okay, we've got another one for you now. They were keen as mustard, and fair play to them for that, but they really wanted to prove that their system could work in this environment, even though we told everyone that it wouldn't. And this went on all day, basically, and every time the diver went in, it was a shopping trolley, it was a tyre, it was a moped, it was a, builder's bag full of rubble or whatever, and it just went on. And at the end of the day, we said to them, okay, show us on paper then, here's a map, tell us where you started, where you finished, we need to know what you searched. I mean, we were never going to trust them, we were going to have to put divers in anyway, because we'd seen how they'd been working. And they then told us, the GPS system didn't work that well, and in fact we kept, hitting items on the bottom that were sticking up, so it's not entirely accurate, but kind of here and kind of there. It was all very wishy-washy, and we had to go back to the detectives and go, by all means, use these guys, but you cannot say hand on heart at the end of it that you've searched this area, and we are going to have to go back and research it anyway, so I'm afraid you're no better off. We have given it a go, we've tried, but it just doesn't work. And I think eventually they could see the issues. So you know, it was decided that we would continue on as we did. So that carried on for some months yet. And in fact, finally on the 10th of September, bearing in mind she'd gone missing, or we believe the actual date she was killed was on the 1st of March, 10th of September, so some 6 months later, there's an area called Kingsland Basin, which is came off of the canal. It was basically almost a small marina off of the canal that had a sort of square of flats around it that were overlooking the basin, that had some boats sort of permanently moored up in there, just set back from the main canal. And the community there were very good, and every now and then they got together and had a bit of a clear up to sort of get the rubbish out of the water and stuff. They had a number of grappling hooks and things on the ends of ropes that they were throwing into their basin, you know, to drag the bottom, and they were clearing bags and any rubbish they found in there. They were just having a clean up, basically. We were called down there because one of them had what he thought was a football float to the surface in a bag, and unfortunately it was discovered to be Gemma's head, which was the final piece of her that was missing up until this point. The various limbs had either floated up or been found through the main canal, and the final piece was her head that came up that day. So it was the end to a very long search. Now, the brother had already been charged. He was charged within about 2 weeks of her going missing because of this very sort of damning, you know, CCTV evidence of him dragging this heavy suitcase down onto the canal, and they could subsequently identify that that was the suitcase that was then found with her torso in. So he'd already been charged, but obviously our intention was to recover all of her. And the wheels of justice slowly moved, and then on the 14th of January 2013, Tony McCluskie, her brother, went to trial for the murder of his sister. It turns out that he was a heavy cannabis user, so no doubt that added to his paranoia, as always happens with heavy sort of drug users, particularly cannabis. You know, they get very, very paranoid and sort of argumentative and convinced the world's out to get them. He admitted, you know, that he'd had frequent arguments with his sister, and it didn't seem to go particularly well living together. On the evening of the first, they'd had an argument about an overflowing bath, and she had told him to leave. He admitted that he then grabbed her by the wrists and punched her to the floor, and then he says he has no recollection of you know, what happened next. Of course, that's very convenient, and we'll actually never know what truly happened and how her life ended, although the cause of death was given as several blows with a blunt instrument. So something's happened after that. He then obviously set about the fairly gruesome task of dismembering her and distributing her down the canal, as we now know. And then the trial lasted for, you know, a couple of weeks or so, and then on the 30th of January 2013, he was found guilty of the murder of his sister, and he received a life imprisonment, and with a minimum of 20 years to serve. And I believe he's on the Isle of Wight currently in one of the Cat A prisons there, although he may have moved on from there. Certainly at one point he was on the Isle of Wight in the UK. So yeah, very sad case really, and unbelievable, you know, that a brother can do that to his sister. But a very long job for us, very challenging for sure, lots of different aspects to it. And like I say, probably the first high profile one that I was involved in. So that constantly working with the family and the press and the detectives, you know, it was quite involved for sure. But that's that. Hope you found that interesting. Sorry, I'm an issue with the microphone falling off. Hopefully you found that interesting, and we'll continue on next week. Have a good week. I'll speak to you soon. Cheers, bye.